just brief introduction. David knows Stuart from other kinds of collaborations. He also knows one of our faculty members who's been on leave this year, Jim Blumenthal. And that's, I think, because of the collegial nature of the work they do, particularly with Indian religions, Buddhism, and so forth. I had my first opportunity to connect with David last fall when I was sort of making the rounds of religious studies programs in the state of Oregon, and just to sort of pick everyone's brains to see what good ideas they might have. And David and his colleague, Bill Miller, not only waited for me an hour after our scheduled meeting time, because I got caught up in what's called the Dundee Triangle of traffic going into McMinnville. So they were gracious enough to wait that long for me. But again, it's been very supportive of our efforts to develop religious studies initiatives here on campus. So he's going to give a presentation today on some recent work that he's been doing in Buddhist philosophy. And so David, we're appreciative that you could come down for this afternoon.
Let me just say thank you to all of you who showed up here on a Friday afternoon before Memorial Day weekend. This has given me a nice opportunity to get a jump start on some work I'm doing this summer. This is a paper, a version of which I'll be giving in Austria in August at an international conference for Buddhist studies on a panel that I hope to put together on knowledge and power in Buddhist philosophy. It's a paper that I gave also at the, or a version of which, an earlier version of which I gave at the American Academy of Religion Conference in November this past year. So I got some good feedback there and had some ideas sort of bouncing around in my head about it for a few months, but I've been really involved in teaching and other things. So I haven't had a chance to sort of put my head together on this. So this gave me a good opportunity to do that. And so thank you to everybody for Courtney for inviting me, and to Stuart for being here, and everyone else.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm a late person.
It's okay.
I'm Amy Cole, I teach the history of American religion.
Nice to meet you.
It's very good to be here.
Thank you. Great to be here. So I have a handout in lieu of projecting anything above my head. And this is what serves as a rather, I don't know, minimalist handout of a couple of slides that might be hard to read because it's so small. So sorry about that. But at the very least, maybe it's a little something that it's better than nothing, maybe.
Great.
Anyway, so the title, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to read the paper that I've written. It should take me, around a half hour to read through this. I wasn't quite sure what my audience was going to be. Hopefully it's not going to go over everybody's head here except for Stuart's. I know that Stuart's going to be on board with this. I'm very happy to stop and discuss any aspects of this. For me, this was helpful to sort of put it down on paper, and I'm at that point of the semester where my brain is fried completely. So on some level, in order to avoid rambling too much, it made sense to just sort of write it and see where we go from there. So anyway, I'm very happy for any comments, and I hope you'll take whatever you can from what I've got to present here. So the paper is entitled Knowledge, Power, and Right in a text called the Abhidharmakośabhāṣya. I'll say a little bit about what that text is in a minute. But when one mentions knowledge, power, and right in the same sentence, one cannot help to evoke thoughts of Michel Foucault among modern Western academics who have read anything at all about philosophy, I guess, or critical theory in the last 30 years. So this paper did not begin as an attempt to apply Foucault's ideas, or for that matter, any modern sociological or political philosophy to classical Indian Buddhist thought. Instead, it's grown out of research that I've been doing for a number of years into different scholastic formulations and discussions of Buddhist conceptions of the wondrous, and connections between wonders and a range of extraordinary powers, extraordinary knowledges, types of knowledge. So in theory, in Buddhist theory, a variety of types of extraordinary knowledge and powers may be acquired through the practice of the Buddhist path, including meditation and not limited to meditation. So Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakośabhāṣya and Bhāṣya, Bhāṣya would be the commentary, the self-commentary on verses. That's going to form the basis for this paper. This is a 4th, 5th century scholastic, highly scholastic, theoretical presentation of the Buddhist path. All right, so the path you would take on which at least some of the results of that path, fruits of taking that path, would be forms of extraordinary power or knowing. All right, we might call it spiritual power, but it also has temporal quality, so temporal / spiritual power. Okay, so after discovering a relationship in this text, or at least apparently posited in this text, between power, knowledge, and right, in some sense of these terms, and what I'm trying to do is work out precisely in what sense of power, knowledge, and right the terms are connected. The impulse arose for me to consider Foucault and other people, such as Pierre Bourdieu, who have discussed the relationship between knowledge, power, systems of discipline, systems of education, systems of control. The question I asked was, could thinking about these thinkers together, so Vasubandhu in the 4th century in India, and Pierre Bourdieu, Foucault, and others, could that help to sharpen my understanding of these various thinkers and what they have to say about the topic? So it's far from obvious, I think, that they're talking about the same thing. But having said that, one way to conceive this project as an extension of Foucault's work is related to the notion that he has of subjugated knowledge. Anybody has read some Foucault, this is one of his ideas, subjugated knowledge. So in a work of his called Society Must Be Defended, Foucault describes 2 forms of subjugated knowledge, which may serve as objects for genealogical investigations, the term that he uses to describe what he's doing. So firstly, quote, he describes subjugated knowledge in this way. He says, quote, blocks of historical knowledges that were present in the functional and systematic ensembles, but which were masked, end quote, or, quote, buried in functional coherences and systematic ensembles, end quote. So that's one thing. And then secondly, here's another quote, what he means by subjugated knowledge. A whole series of knowledges that have been disqualified as non-conceptual knowledges, as insufficiently elaborated knowledges, naive knowledges, hierarchically inferior knowledges, knowledges that are below the required level of erudition or scientificity. Now, I don't claim to know precisely what Foucault means here by either one of these things, but part of what I do understand him to mean is that these subjugated knowledges or subjugated articulations of knowledge are local. That's one of the things he wants to say. They're local, they're marginal, or they're individualized, in contrast to a unitary theoretical system of knowledge that claims to subsume all marginal and individual articulations into an overarching structure. That would be your science. Okay, so in this respect, for somebody who knows something about Indian philosophy, it's possibly odd to speak of Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakośabhāṣya as an example of subjugated or marginalized or individualized knowledge, because from the narrow perspective of the intellectual history of Buddhist philosophy, the Abhidharmakośabhāṣya would be, or would seem to be, a perfect example of precisely the kind of unitary theoretical knowledge reflective of an institutionalized Buddhist monasticism. Precisely the type of discourse against which Foucault or somebody would want to attempt to construct a genealogy of local knowledges. Or as Foucault would say, to raise, quote, an insurrection against centralized power effects that are bound up with the institutionalization and workings of any scientific discourse organized in a society. End quote. Okay. So, insofar as the Abhidharmakosha seems to represent a high-status discourse of Buddhist monasticism, it would not qualify as subjugated knowledge in this narrower sense of the term. And yet, from our own perspective, our modern Western perspective, especially if we think about the rash of recent attempts to study meditation and its effects scientifically, through the lenses of cognitive psychology, neuroscience, or other modern sciences, as well as the common attempt these days to make Indian philosophy speak the same language as modern analytical philosophy. From this broader perspective, it seems to me that the Abhidharmakosha and other examples of classical Buddhist philosophy may well count as forms of subjugated knowledge. And a genealogy based on them might well bear fruit in freeing it from some kind of, from its modern appropriations. Also, I would say that the section of the Abhidharmakosha that I'm looking at here is a part that nobody, modern or Western, seems to be discussing at all. So in that sense, it also represents something that is marginalized, perhaps, within at least Western understandings of classical Indian Buddhist thought, at least when those thoughts are made to speak from modern concerns or to modern concerns. Okay, so nevertheless, when Foucault speaks of knowledge and its relation to power, he speaks of power/knowledge, right? He doesn't talk about knowledge and power, he talks about the two interconnected, by which he means that knowledge cannot emerge except from within systems in which power relations are already operating. This is his idea. In this way, knowledge becomes an effective power, right? And understanding their relationship requires taking into account a third axis, namely right or ethics. Okay, so to quote again from Society Must Be Defended, understanding the mechanisms of power involves, quote, establishing two markers. On the one hand, the rules of right that formally delineate power. And on the other hand, at the opposite extreme, the other limit might be the truth effects that power produces, that this power conducts, and which in their turn reproduce that power. Okay? So we're just talking about knowledge, power, and right. Power producing knowledge, right putting limits on power. In this regard, Foucault speaks about the traditional question of political philosophy being, quote, how does the discourse of truth, or quite simply philosophy, establish the limits of power's right? End quote. The question that Foucault wants to ask, the question, quote, from below, end quote, this is his genealogical work, is this one. He says, quote, what are the rules of right that power implements to produce discourses of truth? He asserts, quote, power cannot be exercised unless a certain economy of discourses of truth functions in and on the basis of and thanks to that power. End quote. So despite utilizing some concepts seemingly similar on the surface, it's not entirely clear that Vasubandhu's concerns in the Abhidharmakośabhāṣya align with those of Foucault. And yet, one finds knowledge, power, and right somehow intertwined. How do we understand this curious intersection? This paper aims to show, now I'm kind of getting into my own work here on Vasubandhu, this paper aims to show that for Vasubandhu, knowledge is intrinsically related to power. There's a lot writing on the word intrinsically here. Knowledge is intrinsically related to power, understood primarily as control over oneself and control over others and external objects. Okay, so that's different. Right? Control over self, control over others, and external objects. In other words, Vasubandhu attempts to reduce power to knowledge while simultaneously asserting that knowledge actively manifests itself both internally and externally as power over its objects. Even though knowledge is manifold in relation to its various objects, this intrinsic relationship to power seems to characterize knowledge as such. Though it may be the case that he thinks that some forms of knowledge are more true and therefore more powerful than other types. This is going to maybe become clear to you, I hope, as I talk. So, at the same time, the knowledge of which Vasubandhu speaks is mostly what I'm going to call cultivated knowledge. All right, cultivated. And it is here that one finds the intersection with the concept of right. In other words, the knowledge in which Vasubandhu is mostly interested, what he's mostly theorizing in this work, is one produced through the cultivation of certain prescribed norms and insights. Okay, so it's knowledge produced having internalized norms and insights that are prescribed. So that's power, right? So thus, Vasubandhu's discussion of the path and the powerful knowledge that is one of its chief outcomes suggests an implicit justification of the Buddhist institution and its norms, despite, or in fact, precisely because of the fact that he describes the cultivation of this powerful knowledge using a trope of the sovereign individual. Okay. So hopefully that'll become clear. So, okay, knowledge and its types. Knowledge of some sort seems central to Vasubandhu's presentation of the Buddhist path. In chapter 6, verse 67, Vasubandhu defines Buddhist awakening, this is the goal of the Buddhist path, as consisting in two types of knowledge. Knowledge that the underlying causes of suffering have been eliminated, and knowledge that they will no longer arise. He then elaborates upon knowledge in chapter 7, where he presents a list of 10 types of knowledge. Here you have that first slide is the 10 types. This list is common to Buddhist scholastic discourse and results from combining several lists found in various canonical sutras, or canonical discourses, Buddhist scriptures, if you will. So the starting point for Vasubandhu is not knowledge as such, right? But various canonical Buddhist understandings of knowledge. And his goal and ours is, I think, understanding whether and how there can be an overarching conception of knowledge that emerges from these various types. So does Vasubandhu believe that there are multiple types of knowledge, or is knowledge really just one kind of thing? At the very beginning of chapter 7, he seems to define knowledge singularly as quote, certainty, nischaya, or absence of doubt. So knowledge is defined that way. But he distinguishes it from simply having a view, or we might say an opinion, even when the view one holds is the correct one. Knowledge can arise through sensory contact in an ordinary sense. It also involves the mind. But then he goes on to characterize knowledge as being either pure or impure, depending on whether it is influenced by or somehow associated with states or objects that produce or are produced by passion, continued existence, false opinion, and ignorance. So here we have the second one where I'm distinguishing pure, he's distinguishing pure from impure knowledge. And then you got the 10 types of knowledge classified in terms of, right, those basic categories, pure and impure. All right, so perhaps it seems odd to speak of impure knowledge, and yet this distinction is crucial for Vasubandhu because it allows him to distinguish what he calls conventional knowledge from the specific types of knowledge that lead to and constitute awakening, right, the goal of the Buddhist path, as I said before. The distinctions between conventional and ultimate knowledge and between impure and pure knowledge seem very basic to him, and yet they're difficult to understand from an epistemological point of view. On the one hand, these distinctions seem to harken back to the beginning of chapter 6 of his work, where he makes this distinction between conventional and ultimate truth. And that distinction is drawn alongside that between knowledge, what he calls knowledge arising from hearing the scriptures, from knowledge arising from reasoning, and knowledge arising from cultivation. So you can get knowledge from these three spheres, right? You can get knowledge from hearing, right? I mean, you're going to hear some stuff that I say, and that's going to give you knowledge, a certain kind of knowledge. There's knowledge that could arise for you from reflecting on what I'm saying, right? But then Vasubandhu distinguishes this third type of knowledge, which results from cultivation, right? So that might be the kind of knowledge that you would achieve if you took to heart some of what I'm saying, he's saying, and practiced the Buddhist path, and saw for yourself whether certain kinds of knowledge arise. All right. So on one line of interpretation, the whole of chapters 6, 7, and 8, this is the last 3 chapters, more or less, except for the conclusion of the work, constitute an attempt to characterize certain the relationship between certain stages of cultivation on the path, the Buddhist path, and the attainment of certain special qualities of mind, including certain types of knowledge, which we might call cultivated knowledge. This is what we're calling cultivated knowledge. Okay, so on the one hand, Vasubandhu seems to want his presentation to do more than simply distinguish conventional knowledge from cultivated knowledge, because he also classifies some types of cultivated knowledge as conventional or impure. Okay, so it's got some things working here. He affirms that certain worldly paths of cultivation, will result in certain types of powerful knowledge that will nonetheless remain conventional or impure because they do not take the 4 noble truths in their 16 aspects as objects of knowledge, and therefore do not result in knowledge constitutive of Buddhist awakening. Now, I'm sure that for most of you, this is way too high, but the idea here is that there's certain truths that are basic to Buddhism that the Buddha has insight into. Truths about the world, truths about ourselves. All right? So what he's saying is that there are certain kinds of knowledge that can be cultivated in the world that gives you certain power in the world, and yet it won't take you to the full extent of the Buddhist path, because it doesn't have as its content, it doesn't engage with what is really ultimately true with respect to the world. Okay. All right. So I'll be happy to explain that more.
So far, so good.
Okay, so Vasubandhu, all right. Vasubandhu seems to want to present a more comprehensive system that provides a basis for distinguishing not only between conventional and cultivated knowledge, ordinary and special knowledge, but also between some types of cultivated powerful knowledge that remain conventional and other types. Okay? So an illustration of this kind of complexity can be shown through the example of what he has to say about knowing other people's minds. Right? This is one of the types of knowledge, right, that we're talking about, knowledge of others' minds. All right, so that's a type of cultivated, powerful knowledge. Right? It's classified as one of the 10 basic types. It's also classified as one of 6 types of higher knowledges that he discusses in chapter 7. That's going to be in there somewhere, maybe. Maybe not. Anyway, he classifies it in a couple of different ways. There's certain preparatory practices leading to its acquisition. So there's certain things we do, we prepare to lead to other things, right? Okay, so then this type of knowledge, it takes as its object the mind and the mental factors, so the mental constituents, the supporting factors of mind, of another living being. So, okay, the mind and mental factors of that other living being may be either pure or impure. Okay, so, and it may involve conventional knowledge or not, depending on what's happening in the mind of the other living being, whose mind one is reading. Vasubandhu describes a hierarchy whereby beings at a certain level of attainment, corresponding to some degree with different levels of the universe, may cultivate knowledge of the minds of other living beings at the same or lesser levels of attainment within the universe. Okay, so we boil this down to say that the Buddha can read the minds of human beings and other gods, or gods, but it's not necessarily God. But gods and other human beings can't read the Buddha's mind because the Buddha has advanced beyond the level of their capability. Right? So, okay. So it's theoretically possible for one living being to gain knowledge of another living being's mind as that person's experiencing moments of pure knowing on the path of seeing. So this is complicated, but the basic idea would be that you could have knowledge of another being's mind, say if you're both awakened or both enlightened, right? You could, if you're enlightened, you could read the other person's mind at the moment they are becoming enlightened, right? That would be a kind of pure knowing of another's mind, whereas normally it would not be. It would just be knowing ordinary thoughts that are impure or conventional. Okay, so second section, knowledge and its relation to power. Having dealt in a preliminary way with knowledge, we can turn our attention to power. So here as well, Vasubandhu inherits a much broader Buddhist discourse, one in which knowledge and power seem to be synonymous or symmetrical in some way. The bulk of Chapter 7 of the Abhidharmakośabhāṣya consists in explaining the 10 types of knowledge and how they may be correlated with or somehow provide a basis for a broader range of qualities or attainments, including what are called the so-called 6 higher knowledges. This is the Abhijñā, and what are called the 18 special qualities of the Buddha. So these are qualities that only the Buddha possesses. I have a bit on this. This is the next thing. Cultivated qualities consisting in knowledge and considered in Chapter 7 of the Abhidharmakośabhāṣya. All right, so it's also the 6 higher knowledge and also the 18 special qualities. The latter includes what are called the 10 powers that consist in knowledge. Okay. I think that's the next slide. 10 powers consisting in knowledge. The stock phrasing of the 10 powers of the Buddha offer a clue about the basic meaning of power in this context and begin to draw the connection to knowledge. So in a paragraph that introduces the 10 powers in a variety of canonical sources and it's repeated in the description in this text of each individual member of the list, we read that the Buddha, the Tathagata is a name for the Buddha, endowed with these powers, assumes the rightful place of chief, sounds the lion's roar in the assemblies, and sets in motion the wheel of Brahma. I can explain what this means, but basically the idea is that power here appears active and outwardly directed. The Tathagata, or the Buddha, does something with these powers. He preaches the Dharma, right? And as he preaches, he confidently establishes his authority and asserts it over others. That's what it means to say, sounds the lion's roar, assumes the rightful place of chief, and so forth. Okay. But notice that these are powers that consist in knowledge. So as each of the various powers is enumerated and described, an explicit connection is made with knowledge. Each of the 10 powers is described as a particular type of knowledge. For example, the first power of the Tathagata is described as follows. Now, monks, the Tathagata knows in truth what is possible and what is impossible. That the Tathagata knows in truth what is possible and what is impossible is the first power of the Tathagata, right? So there's a kind of knowledge, right? It's laid out in detail, and then it's stated to be a power, okay, a form of power. So Vasubandhu explains that all 10 types of knowledge combine to form the basis for this power. All the 10 types come in and form the basis for this power in its active manifestation. When we consider them more broadly, we see that the 10 powers encompass a broad sphere of knowledge. They include actions and their effects, meditative states and accomplishments, the various paths to their attainment, the various faculties and aspirations of living beings, as well as the 3 key components constitutive of awakening. This refers to the, thanks so much, the remembrance of past lives. So the Buddha remembers all of his past lives. Knowledge of the arising and passing away of living beings. So the Buddha knows basically the destinies, the trajectories of all other beings living in the world. And he also has certainty that the underlying roots of suffering have been destroyed, and that he has a chance. This is basically part and parcel of what it means to become awakened. So some of these specific types of knowledge are directed inwardly. So I think they're directed inwardly towards certainty about oneself. Some of them are directed outwardly, so in terms of knowledge about others or the world. But it's not difficult to see, I don't think anyway it is, how knowledge here could be manifested as power over oneself as well as over others. So in this way, the connection between the 10 powers and the 4 confidences becomes clear. I'm not going to go into that right now. So a passage from chapter 6 helps to illuminate the notion of power further, though in a different context of distinguishing between 5 types of powers, bala, this is the next slide, 5 types of powers, and the 5 faculties, or indriyas, within the 37 limbs of awakening. So this would be a kind of, the 37 limbs refers to a sort of schematic almost of the kinds of practices and the kinds of qualities that one is trying to develop. All right? So these lists contain identical members, all right, from the tradition. And so the question becomes, since they're identical, Vasubandhu explains the difference between them as one of relative strength or potency. So here I think this explanation has to do with what he means by power. He says the faculties are weak, while the powers are full-blown. And this is because a faculty may be suppressed, while a power may not. His commentator, the sub-commentator named Yashomitra, adds that suppression here means that the states under discussion, here I'll give you some Sanskrit, I'm basically just quoting, or it's translating my quotation here. But anyway, so Yashomitra adds that suppression here means that the states under discussion, when considered as faculties, may be ground down by their opposing states. So in other words, if faith is something we're trying to achieve and we can have it as a faculty and also as a power, then it can be ground down or suppressed by lack of belief, doubt, if you will, right, when it's considered as a faculty. But when it's considered as a power, when it's full-blown in the person of the Buddha, for instance, you can't grind it down. It's not possible. So faith can be ground down by its opposite. Zest can be ground down by torpor. Mindfulness can be ground down by inattention or suppressed by inattention. Concentration by distraction. Discernment by incomprehension. So this is not the case when these states are considered as powers. So this is what I'm saying indicates that power means, for him, means active, fully manifest, not mere potentiality. All right, so it's something full-blown. Vasubandhu employs a similar line of reasoning in the context of explaining the 10 powers. In a commentary on verse 30, a question arises concerning what it means to say that the 10 powers are unique to a Buddha. The question is asked, why are these 10 types of knowledge not called powers in another person? Why are they called powers only of the Buddha? The reason given is that these types of knowledge are unlimited or unrestricted for the Buddha, whereas for others they may have restrictions or limitations. Therefore, the Buddha's knowledge is called power, whereas others' knowledge is not called power. It's just knowledge. So as an example, Vasubandhu mentions a story about his chief disciple, a guy named Shariputra, who interestingly is characterized as the one who has, among the Buddha's disciples, the greatest wisdom, or the greatest knowledge. So there's something deliberate about his choice of this particular story. So he mentions a story about this disciple, Shariputra, denying a person entry into the monastic order because he cannot see that the person possesses any roots of liberation. Roots of liberation would be potentiality for success on the path. Okay? Right, Shariputra has superhuman powers, and so he's able to look into our trajectory, into our destinies, where we've been to some extent, and see where we could go. Right? So he looks. Shariputra doesn't see anything that indicates that this person is going to be successful, and therefore denies him entry into the monastic order. Right? So the Buddha admits the person because he's able to see more deeply into that person's faculties. Right? So the story demonstrates how the Buddha's knowledge may be considered as a form of power because its reach is completely unrestricted. The commentary concludes its discussion to this effect. It says, because the Buddhas possess a knowledge that is unrestricted to such an effect, to such an extent, the power of the Buddha's mind is unlimited in regard to the scope of what is knowable to it. End quote. Interestingly, the following verse shifts in topic to the power of the Buddha's body, and among the several interpretations of the extent of the Buddha's physical power is one claim that it must be unlimited because it must contain the power of its mind, which is already established to be unlimited. Right? So unlimited mind, therefore unlimited body. Okay. All right, so another sense of power emerges from the discussion of the higher knowledges. And here you see back again in the next thing, higher knowledges, mundane and transmundane. The higher knowledges, the first 5 of them considered worldly, right, is at the bottom of the second to the last slide here. So it includes flying and appearing in multiple places at the same time, walking on water, and so forth. All right, so before we get there, I want to talk briefly about the quality of agreeableness and the 4 types of special knowledge, which are discussed in verses 37 through 40 of the text. Look, a question arises: why are these qualities included in the discussion of knowledge? Chapter 7 is devoted to a discussion of knowledge. Why are these included? What does agreeableness have to do with knowledge? But this becomes clear in light of its relationship to power, specifically power over others. So agreeableness is described as the power or ability to hinder the arising of anger or contention towards oneself. Okay. So, in other words, right? A person has the power, the Buddha has the power of agreeableness in the sense that he's able to make sure that nobody feels disagreeable towards him. The special types of knowledge also seem directly, specifically directed at influencing other people and their reactions to the teachings. So they focus upon qualities related to teaching. Knowing the verbal teachings, their meaning and significance, their etymologies, being able to convey them with eloquence. That's what the 4 special knowledges are. So we see that power is considered here as knowledge and has its basis controlling others, their reactions to one's teachings. So the broader relationship between knowledge and power is perhaps most clearly represented in these so-called higher knowledges. They're defined in the Kosha as direct realization of knowledge applied to particular objects or spheres and they have as their defining characteristic the knowledge achieved on the path to liberation. So flying and so forth would be here. Approximately 1/3 of the chapter discusses them, how they're cultivated, their relationship to the 10 types of knowledge, the 10 powers, other related concepts such as the 3 types of wonder. The correlation between knowledge, power, and wonder suggests how knowledge manifests itself inwardly as self-assurance, certainty, and control, and that it may also be directed outwardly as power over others and over external objects. So regarding the 3 types of knowledge often portrayed as central to awakening, this has to do with knowledge of past lives, knowledge of others' destinies, and certainty with respect to one's own achievement. They're often, they're contained in this list of higher knowledges. They're also contained in the 3 powers. Verse 45 raises a question. It says, why are they called knowledge? Vasubandhu answers that they're called knowledge because they eliminate ignorance with respect to the past, present, and the future. Ignorance is a word that means, it's the opposite of knowledge. Vidya is knowledge, avidya is ignorance here. So the higher knowledges eliminate ignorance within oneself, but also in others. So through the wondrous demonstrations of his superhuman power, of knowing others' minds, of teaching the Dharma, that's how he's eliminating ignorance in others. That's why they're called knowledges. And it has to do with their power, in a sense, right? Okay, so third to almost last section here. This brings us to the topic of cultivation, all right? Cultivation, I think, is the key concept for understanding the conceptual paradigm through which the relationship between knowledge and power is conceived in this text. The whole discussion of knowledge and its relation to power takes place in the broader context of discussing certain qualities achieved through practicing the path. A key section of chapter 7, running from verses 19 to 27, focuses specifically on cultivation, and the theme reappears in different ways throughout the rest of the chapter. So perhaps the single most important Buddhist technical term for cultivation is the word bhavana, all right, which means developing something or making something become what it is. Yeah. So that's one of the technical terms, but I'm using cultivation more broadly to convey this general idea that powerful knowledge is fostered or developed through the internalization of a set of prescribed norms and practices. Right? So now I'm in the field of right, all right? Foucault's field of right. So Buddhist theoretical discourse on the path, like the Abhidharmakośabhāṣya, explicitly asserts that powerful knowledge emerges from practicing a particular form of life, one that's both assumed and outlined in Kosha. The specific details of what type of knowledge counts or is cultivated, at what stages, by what methods, all of this is really complicated, and to lay it out, to understand it even, requires a very sophisticated understanding of Buddhist theoretical discourse on the path. But just to be very brief and sort of simplify this picture for you, Vasubandhu asserts that ordinary Buddhists and non-Buddhists may cultivate what he calls conventional knowledge, and non-Buddhist ascetics may achieve knowledge of others' minds, but only Buddhas and, if you will, Buddhist saints can cultivate all 10 types of knowledge that he's laid out. Okay, so they're really cultivated exclusively in the Buddhist path. So stepping back, if you look at this kind of the way his description works, a picture starts to emerge where various types of knowledge are nested within higher types of knowledge, ultimately culminating in a kind of cultivated, powerful knowledge of the Buddha. As one progresses from one stage to the next, one cultivates dispassion towards the lower stage. This is going to be a key concept of dispassion here. I'm going to return to it in a second. But this is an ethical, I think it's an ethical notion. Okay. Dispassion. Indifference. Something. Okay, so cultivate dispassion toward the lower stage as one acquires mastery over it, and then progresses to the higher stage. So you cultivate dispassion. At the same moment you're cultivating mastery, you're gaining mastery, and then you progress to a higher stage. So the key moment describing this process appears in verse 26, which discusses the cultivation of the knowledge largely constitutive of the final and complete awakening of a Buddha. This is going to be the knowledge that the underlying causes of suffering have been destroyed. This is this kind of certainty that the Buddha has that his knowledge is ultimate. Okay, so the third foot of verse 26 states, quote, when cultivating knowledge, here I'm on my final thing. When cultivating the knowledge of destruction, right, this is the knowledge that the underlying roots of suffering have been destroyed. One also cultivates the impure qualities of all the levels. So here you get the sense of this nesting process, right? At the highest stage of acquisition of knowledge, all the other knowledges are nested within it, including all the impure stuff. So Vasubandhu explains in his commentary, he says, at the moment of the destruction, however, those who achieve the knowledge of destruction, this is going to be the Buddhas, cultivate even the impure qualities of all the levels. What does this mean? Well, he talks about the meditation on the impure. This is a kind of meditation. For what it's worth, it's not meditation on corpses. Mindfulness of breathing. This is what often goes these days as meditation, properly so called, right? Mindfulness of the breath. The applications of mindfulness. Now, this is a technical term. The immeasurables is another technical term, but the immeasurables refer to, for instance, the meditation on loving kindness, the meditation on compassion, the meditation on equanimity, some basic Buddhist meditation techniques, the liberating meditations, we go into that, and the rest. So all of these are considered impure, right, because they're in the world, right? They take as their object things that are, quote unquote, impure, conventional. So, what does he say? He says, it's as though they, and here I think he means the qualities or the things that result from, so the qualities of resulting from practicing these meditations. It's as though they expand like a bag whose cords are cut. So they just kind of expand, right? All accompanying good qualities approach one who has obtained sovereignty over one's own mind. I think that's a key phrase. Obtained sovereignty over one's own mind. And the word sovereignty is an interesting one to consider. It's really the political, philosophical term, adhirajya, right? I mean, sovereignty. This is the sovereign, in a literal sense. So the Buddha, right? So all accompanying good qualities approach one who has obtained sovereignty over one's own mind, just like vassals bearing offerings would approach one who has obtained the supreme kingship. So the knowledge of destruction is thus a kind of summative and comprehensive state. And at its expansive summit appears the sovereign individual. Although this is the only place in which this trope of sovereignty explicitly appears in Vasubandhu's discussion of powerful knowledge and its cultivation, it seems really significant in light of broader Indian discourse on sovereignty, which I'm not going to discuss, but this is part of the larger project, right? How religious discourses, religious philosophical discourses reflect, political discourses on sovereignty, and vice versa. So more work needs to be done to connect Buddhist discourse on knowledge, power, and right to this broader Indian discourse on sovereignty. The context here is one of cultivation, and it's difficult to ignore the explicit figuration of the Buddhas in terms of and other Buddhist saints, if you will, in terms of the sovereign. So the sovereign individual is one in whom knowledge and power reside, and from whom they emanate. However, sovereignty here is achieved through gaining mastery over one's own mind, a process said to involve observation and thorough investigation of mental phenomena and the objects of the senses as they exist in reality. One cultivates dispassion towards these phenomena, observes and investigates them, and thereby obtains knowledge of and power over them. In a sense, one gains a kind of sovereignty through surveillance, through overseeing or seeing from above. Right? As we have seen, this powerful knowledge may manifest itself as self-control in the form of confidence, strength, and equanimity, It also manifests itself as control over others and nature through teaching the doctrine and building institutions, demonstrations of superhuman power, reading other people's minds, controlling their responses to one's teaching. All right, so now I can wrap up, conclusion. So while the Abhidharmakośabhāṣya invokes the trope of the sovereign individual, that is the Buddha or the paradigmatic Buddhist worthy or saint, as the locus for knowledge and power, it nonetheless outlines in theory, a set of paths to actualizing this state of sovereignty through internalization of a discipline, a set of prescribed norms and insights. So this is the part about right, or ethics. So this might suggest an implicit or even an explicit justification of certain institutionalized regimes of power as the means through which powerful knowledge is obtained. This justification is made through the very process of articulating a theoretical discourse on the path, one that specifies the qualities to be cultivated, how to cultivate them, who may successfully do so. Insofar as the locus of power is conceptualized as the sovereign individual, it would ostensibly mask the extent to which power is distributed throughout society and localized within the Buddhist institution and its institutionalized practices. If so, then perhaps Buddhist theory on the path is susceptible to critique by some modern sociological analyses of knowledge, power, and their relationship to institutional dynamics of authority. At the same time, however, the problem that the modern critique of knowledge and power, and right, I would add, is arguably attempting to address is how we may best understand and thereby negotiate the various social and institutional norms to which every individual is inevitably subjected. Buddhist theoretical discourse on the path challenges us to reconsider the relationship between internalizing prescribed norms and the acquiring of personal sovereignty, and between sovereignty and surveillance as modes of conceptualizing the relationship between knowledge, power, and cultivation. Foucault's interest in mechanisms of power and the relations of force led him to look for places where power becomes, to quote him, capillary or infinitesimal, right? This is going to be the local, the archives that nobody looks at, the marginalized or the excluded, the individual. Right? So he sees the individual as an effect of power, right? To quote him again, quote, "The individual is not power's opposite number. The individual is one of power's first effects." End quote. Thus, the process that links the three analytical axes of knowledge, power, and right for Foucault is what he calls subjectivation. All right, so subjectivation is the process by which persons are made into subjects in the dual sense of the term. Political subjects within a society and individual subjects with individual subjectivities. In this sense, the Buddhist discourse we've been discussing seems to represent an attempt at a unitary theorization of a form of subjectivation. All right, one might mention among the various Buddhist, form of subjectivation, yeah. So what it results in, right, is the production of specific types of individuals or specific types of subjects. Among the Buddhist forms of subjectivation, we could mention bodily subjectivation, verbal subjectivation, and mental subjectivation. This is the body, speech, and mind, which is traditional in Buddhist understandings of the person. So you could give the example of taking refuge, a kind of Buddhist ritual, as a form of subjectivation, right? Creating a Buddhist individual. You can also think about doing prostrations or making offerings. So doing prostrations involves something with the body, right? You're doing a series of say 10,000 full bowings in your living room or whatever over the course of a month, right? So you're actually doing stuff. I guess you could say running, right, is also a form of bodily subjectivation. Okay, so mental training techniques are also involved. That's a different kind of subjectivation, right? Mental training techniques. All right. At the same time, questions arise about what type of subject is being produced by Buddhist techniques of domination and power. Who or what is dominating who or what? what kinds of domination or power relations are implicated in Buddhist quote-unquote sciences, like the Abhidharmakośabhāṣya, if we're going to take that view of it. These are questions I haven't answered. So certainly the Buddha's powers establish his authority. His wonders bring people to the path, and yet the Buddhist theory also recognizes, I think, a type of radical desubjectivation at the end of the Buddhist path. For at the level of ultimate truth, the one where you become the sovereign individual, okay, is actually the moment when you realize, according to the Buddhist tradition, right, that there is no self. Right? There's of course the Buddhist idea of no self, right? So the truths to which the individual becomes aware by practicing the path, and then at the moment of a realization of the knowledge that is the result, the culmination of it, right, actually confirms a kind of radical desubjectivation. So it's kind of paradoxical then, right, that the sovereign individual who has achieved true mastery over mind and nature only appears at this moment of realization of radical desubjectivation. As in the yoga system, dispassion or vairagya becomes the key to achieving powerful knowledge. And at the same time, it's what places limits on knowledge and power in an important way, right? Because it's dispassion that, think in the Western discourse on sovereignty, it's particularly this work by Jean Beth Elshtain on sovereignty. She's interested in this, right? What are the limits on power, right? When you emphasize this notion. So I think here dispassion works in the same way. Okay, so then one might ask whether the yoga system theorizes desubjectivation in quite the same way as does the Buddhist system, or what the implications or results might be of a broader analysis of knowledge, power, and right in Indian path theories in general. For his part, Foucault famously made some gestures in the direction of explaining or accounting for desubjectivation, which I'm not going to go into so much. But what I hope is that through thinking through this process, we're in a position where we could take up this question about processes of subjectivation and desubjectivation further in a kind of dialogue on the nature of the relationship between knowledge, power, and right. So that's what I got. Probably talked for an hour. I talked for an hour. Oh, well. Anyway, I talked for 55 minutes, for 55 minutes. But thank you so much for your attention. Sorry.